Hey, ChatGPT, can you make my Honda Fit look like it's super lifted? That's pretty cool. But seeing that made me thirsty for 45 gallons of water. So you know what? Let's do it for real. So welcome back to Honda Garage, Idaho. In today's video, we're back with my 2011 Honda Fit, which is getting a suspension overhaul. This vehicle is getting the off-road lifted treatment, and right now we're in the middle of that project, so this is part 2 of the series. In a previous video, we checked out the rear end, getting that lifted, seeing how far we could go. If you haven't seen it and you want to, I'll link it down below. But today we're working on the front suspension, getting it lifted, seeing what parts we can use, how high we can get, how much it costs. So let's dive in and take a look. Okay, let's go over a few things quickly before we really get started. So first off, the first part of this series was the rear axle. We got an almost 4-inch lift on the vehicle between the suspension modifications and the larger tires that I'm running. So again, that's the first section. If you haven't seen that, go ahead and watch it. Today we're going to be covering the front end, but there's actually going to be a third part down the road that I'll explain more in a little bit. So right now we do have about an inch extra ground clearance just under, and that's because I'm running oversized tires already on this vehicle. It doesn't have anything to do with the suspension, it's just because the diameter of the tires is larger, so it's holding it just under an inch higher off the ground. That's not going to be factored into the measurements I take today. We're going to be going from the ground right to the fender to measure my stock height, and then we'll measure the change in height from there so you can see just the difference that the parts we install provides, regardless of where your stock height vehicle actually is. And I think I forgot to mention it in the last video, but if anyone is wondering, I'm running 215/65/15 tires on here. These ones I picked up super cheap because the tread is almost gone. I just wanted to test the fitment and see. And at stock height, it absolutely rubs all over the place in here, so a lift is crucial if you want to do a tire size this big. And it's also quite close to the front struts inside here, that lower spring mount. Now, there is enough clearance, I think, even if these were full tread, but you might have to shave or remove this rubber alignment nub for the spring. With that gone, there should be enough space even for a full tread tire, but it is going to be very close. So this is absolutely the biggest tire size I would recommend. For if you're not going to lift at all, I would do something even smaller, but if you are going to lift it, this is the biggest I would choose. And I still have to see, once this is all said and done, if it will rub after the lift. But so far, I think we'll be okay on clearance. But you can see in there, on that plastic, the spots where even just having this on for a few weeks, any kind of turning more than a couple degrees, it rubs and immediately takes out that fender liner. Looks like about 26 3/4. And just like last time, I'm going to measure the opposite side as well and just take the average just to get kind of the most accurate measurement I can, as accurate as this particular setup can be. So we've got that base measurement, and then everything that I show from here on out is going to be the change in height from that spot. So let's go ahead and start getting the front end disassembled. Now in this video, I'm not going to be going in depth on the actual process of removing the front struts from the Honda Fit or taking this coil springs off of the strut assembly itself. I'm going to link down below to the factory service manual if you want to look up and see the procedure for that, getting off the cowling and stuff. I also do have another video I made linked below from my CRZ. And that does show in detail the steps to remove the strut assembly and take it apart. And the process is basically identical mechanically on the Fit. So check that out if you're interested. Okay, I'm at a little stopping point here. I've got almost everything disconnected on the strut and ready to remove except for the nut on my sway bar end link here, which is, as usual for these, pretty seized up and is not wanting to come out. So I'm going to have to cut that link probably at some point and destructively remove it from the strut. But I wanted to take a quick minute to talk about the options we're going to be trying out for lifting the front suspension on the Fit, as well as, like I mentioned in the first video, the newer Fit chassis, the GK 2015 and newer, as well as the CRZ, maybe some other chassis too. I'm not 100% sure, but this stuff should work for that as well. Now I do have these lift spacers. This came in the same kit that we used the block spacers on the rear suspension. And this is basically just something that sits on the top hat and makes it a little bit taller. We're going to have to modify the top mounting hardware a little bit because it extends the top of the strut with a larger kind of collar. So we got to drill out, make the hole a little bigger on top, stuff like that. So we're going to wait to do that till the end actually. And we're going to start off with some more HRV components. Now in the previous video on the rear suspension, we started off with the Insight springs, which helped lift it around an inch. And from what I've read online, the Insight springs on the front don't lift it very much for the same generation from the Fit, the 11 and 12. They just make it a little bit stiffer ride. So I presumed the front insight springs from the newer generation, 2019, that I tested were going to do the same thing. They weren't really going to provide any lift. They would just make it a little bit stiffer. So we're jumping right to HRV suspension to start. I've got the front struts here from an HRV, and what we're going to do is basically disassemble these and our fit struts, and we're going to swap the HRV spring and top perch here over to our fit shocks, and then kind of reassemble it with half of the hardware from each and reinstall it and see where that gets us. All right, so on the bottom here is the strut from the fit that I just removed. So we can see here that end link for the sway bar, and this has been, of course, totally shot. It's super old, so it needed to be replaced anyway. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that off in a moment, but let's take a look and compare our first option, which is gonna be the HRV springs. Now, it would be nice to use the full HRV strut, but the bolt pattern here on the knuckle is completely different from the fit. So unfortunately, I can't just swap a whole HRV strut assembly in. But for now, what we can do is disassemble the top spring mount here on our fit strut, take this little nut off after we compress the spring, remove the bearing, and we'll slide our HRV spring on. I've already got it loosened and removed here. So we're going to take our HRV spring and we're going to use the HRV top mount here and stick that on. And then we can use the fit hardware from there upward. As I have said in the past too, do always use extreme caution when you're working with spring compressors like this. There is a ton of potential energy stored in those. If something breaks or goes loose, epic destruction and injury could follow. So try to be super safe when you're working with these. I like to do a little bit on each side back and forth. As soon as the spring is compressed enough to pull that top mount for the spring away from the bearing a little bit, we can start loosening up this nut. All right, we'll save that bearing and reuse it in just a moment. So there's our fit front spring removed. We've got our strut here, and I am going to remove and reuse the bottom rubber piece from the fit just because it mates correctly with this spot on the strut. That one fits just the same. So now we can go ahead and place this spring on the strut just like so, and tighten it back down and get the top hardware mounted back up. So there we have it. We've got our original fit strut with our HRV spring, including the top mount, our fit lower rubber sleeve here, fit bearing, fit nut, and now we'll put the rest of the fit hardware on top. Basically completely stock configuration. The only thing we swapped out was the spring and this top plate for the spring, which is a bit larger on top here. So I'm going to do the other side real quick and put them on the vehicle, and let's see how much of a lift this gets us. Now keep in mind this is the fit shock underneath here, so the travel is the same. It's not any taller per se. The main thing that's going to give us a lift is that this spring is heavier duty and will not compress as easily. So when the car is actually sitting on the ground loading the suspension, this is stiffer. It'll keep it up high instead of letting it sag down a little bit more with the softer spring. Now for timeliness sake here, when I'm reinstalling these parts to test the height, I'm going to get everything bolted together basically enough to hold it together in a factory style spot. A critical thing to note about this video in particular, at least until later, I'm not going to do anything with the alignment to make sure that everything is still, you know, properly oriented where I want for the tires. This is purely just going to be a height comparison. So I'm going to assemble everything together as far as it needs to be to hold it in a stock-like position, but there may be a little bit of settling or adjustment once you get your alignment done. I'm also not going to bother with the sway bar end links right now. I've still got them cut off and loose. I don't know if reattaching those will affect the suspension height at all. It might a little bit just from torsion or something like that. I'm not really sure. I'm not going to try it out right now. Depending on how the build goes for this fit into the future, I may end up deleting the sway bar completely. Still not sure on that yet. So for right now, I'm just going to leave it disconnected. So keep all this stuff in mind as I start taking measurements and we see where things land afterward. I'm going to use the HRV top nut just for fun. As I mentioned in a previous video, the fit, second and third gen, and the HRV all use the same threading and everything for these. So they're all interchangeable, and I like the third gen fit slash HRV top nut better. It just has better coverage and is a little bit easier to remove, in my opinion, down the road. Okay, we've got our struts reassembled on both sides, so it's time to drop this back down and see how much of a lift we actually got from the stiffer springs. Okay, so after measuring a couple times, raising, relowering the vehicle a couple times, and rolling it back and forth to kind of hopefully help a lot of the hardware settle, it looks like the HRV springs gained us just about 2 inches exactly, which is pretty awesome for just the springs. I'm sure the ride is going to be significantly stiffer, so we'll test that out a little bit later. But now it's time to move on to the next stage, which is going to be adding these spacers on top. Now this is from the same kit that I used for the rear, like I said, so these should add 30 millimeters, or probably based on the rear, closer to another inch, 25 millimeters roughly. So we're going to disassemble this and check out what it takes to install these. And this is going to be the same process whether you're using aftermarket springs or not, because this all has to do with the hardware above the spring top mount. But do make sure to read whatever instructions your specific kit comes with, because there's quite a few available online. This one I found is kind of a mid-range one. And the hardware that comes with each kit might be slightly different. So follow along your instructions that you received to make sure you get it done right. So how does this new spacer kit work? Well, we've got our factory rubber top mount that sits right above the spring. And these kits include a piece that is going to sit directly on top of it to give us that extra height. Now, we're going to have to extend the metal threading of the actual shock somehow to still reach through this extra height so that we can clamp on our top mount on top of the chassis. Now, the way that we're intended to do that is using this threaded extension. So this is going to screw on to the top of the fit shock. We're going to tighten that all the way down with some thread locker just to make sure it's really secure and won't go anywhere. And this will give us that extra height we need to then install the included washer and new nut on top. But in order for that to fit through our factory top mount, we're going to need to drill this hole a bit larger, because the threading diameter on this new post is larger. All right, so the hole that we need to drill in here only needs to be large enough for the threaded portion of this post to pass through. And actually, because mine are so old, there's a clear mark where the installation washer was. And that's going to be my gauge because it is just barely bigger than this post. Again, check the specific kit that you bought to see how large it needs to be. Some are a little different size than others. And I'm going to use a step bit because this is going to help keep everything centered in that hole, which is going to be crucial to make sure it lines up as good as possible. So almost perfectly centered on that hole, and now we've got the right amount of space for our threaded stud to go through. So let's go ahead and get this other one drilled and install these on our struts. Okay, with our strut removed, we're going to keep the nut that holds down the bearing in place, as well as our stock rubber seat. We're going to keep that snapped in here. Now, the kit that I have, this piece is going to slide down completely until it contacts that nut. And the first thing that we're going to do actually is apply some thread locker. The instructions that I have say to use reusable thread locker that can be removed with force but prevents loosening through vibration. So I'm going to use that style. At first, I was a little wary of how this attaches, but I think once it's tightened down really well and all the forces that clamp the strut and body together are really in play, I don't think there's a chance of it going anywhere. So we're going to install this. I am a little disappointed that I picked up this particular kit, which has a round shape to this extension piece. I've seen some that have a hexagonal shape, and that would make it a lot easier to get a wrench on here to tighten it without scratching it up, but I think we'll be okay here. And now we can install this back on the vehicle with this piece centered in place, and then once it passes through the body and that extended top hat, then we can use this washer and nut to reseat it. I do wish there was a piece that goes in the center to sort of keep this extension centered. I don't think it's really going to be a big deal, again, once that top hat's mounted and it's screwed down, but it would be nice just to have that peace of mind that everything is straight and will stay aligned even through heavy movement on the vehicle. Also, another thing to keep in mind is the particular instructions I have say to install some wax or some kind of lubricant in between these surfaces. I'm not going to do that right now, but that might be recommended for long-term use just so that everything, as it settles and gets used to the pressure, can slide around easily without binding up or tearing. Now, in order to get this top mount tightened up in here, I do, of course, have this jacked up to compress it a little bit so that we have as much force coming upward as possible. This threaded stack is as high as possible. So once we tighten it down, it'll be secure. You want to make sure you're tightening all the bolts for the suspension with it loaded in some way. If you tighten everything down and torque it down while it's all loose and then put the weight of the car down, especially on this top mount here, that can push the piston up a little extra, compress some of the rubber, and you'll end up with a loose top nut up here instead. So whether it's on the ground or with a jack before you reassemble everything, do make sure that you compress this a bit before you tighten and torque down that top nut. Okay, so I've got both sides installed. The tops are not tightened down yet. They're basically just finger tight, even though I've got it all the way compressed to bolt everything else together. I've got the rest of our hardware for the brake line and the ABS or the wheel speed sensor wire put together. The sway bar end links are still completely disconnected. I don't have replacements on hand, so I'm just going to leave those off for now and see how it feels. The top mounts I'm a little concerned about because they don't, even at full compression with the weight of the whole vehicle on this jack, they don't squeeze out and fill into the actual strut tower cavity completely. And I've been messing around with a few minutes trying to get these to center. This one is leaning a little bit inboard of the vehicle, and this one is a little bit inboard and to the front of the vehicle, so they don't quite center up. Again, that's something that I feel like center collars between that rubber and the shaft would help keep everything aligned better. I also don't know if maybe it's just that these are compatible with a lot of other JDM vehicles, like the City and the Freed and everything, that may have a smaller tower, so this is designed to accommodate all of them. Regardless, it could be solved with a different kit maybe. If you have a different one and it fills it better, let me know what you have. But for right now, since everything else is bolted together, I'm going to go ahead and get my wheels installed, drop this down, and measure the final height. So it looks like between the HRV springs and the upper spacers, we're at around a 4-inch total lift just on the suspension, but I haven't tightened down the top mounts yet, and I know that's going to squeeze the rubber a lot and lose a little bit of height. But I want to start the car up, drive it out, roll it around a little bit slowly, and tighten down those top mounts for the final time and really torque them in, because right now they're still only really hand tight. And I know that there's probably a 1/2 inch of thread travel or so that I need to actually snug those down and get them in a permanent place. I can also tell already that we have some positive camber going on, so we'll definitely need at least a camber bolt to straighten that back out to 0. Well, unfortunately, driving around a little bit didn't really help my issue. These are still somewhat inside the strut tower or toward the inner edge. So when I tighten this down, I'm hoping this top mount doesn't squeeze too much rubber out one side or the other. It should still be plenty tight. I'm going to torque these down now and then get the rest of the engine bay and everything reassembled. I have heard some reports of the top of people's shock tubes breaking off with lifts like these, and I am installing them on 250k mile factory struts, so I don't have super high hopes for the longevity of this, given the quality of the lift kit and everything, but I'm going to run with it and see how it goes. I am quite excited about the height, so let me get these snugged down and we'll take one more measurement of the final height. For the new top nuts on this kit, the 1/16 wrench that I happen to have seems to work pretty well. I don't know what size the others will come with, and right now it's super easy to tighten just because every turn of this is not snugging it up against the chassis yet, but it's just compressing that rubber top mount. Okay, so that's about tight enough to the point where it's starting to spin the shock tube too. I wish I had a longer Allen key to stick down in here and hold it still so I could really torque this down, but unfortunately I don't have just the right L-shaped wrench to do that. And we can see there are quite a few full turns worth of thread that came out of the top of that nut by the time we actually got it snugged down. And the factory rubber mount is quite squished on one side just because it's not quite centered. So without any further ado, I'm going to go drive this around in a dirt field for a little while, and then I'm going to take it to work tomorrow and we'll see how it handles some heavy off-road style usage as well as some higher speed standard city driving. Well, my admittedly short and somewhat mild torture test proved to be somewhat of a success. Nothing catastrophic happened, although still getting some clunks and rubbing here and there, but we'll sort that out later. Not actually terribly uncomfortable either. I think the combination of the HRV springs with the rubber spacers actually kind of cancels each other out in terms of stiffness and compliance. So still somewhat comfortable. And the next step now is to take it on the roads at higher speeds and see how it feels. Well, so far I've driven about 120 miles with the lift installed, and I have to say it does perform a lot better than I expected. Coming from another Fit and a CRZ that have a lot of handling mods to improve the performance, it's certainly not a great handling vehicle. Given that the sway bar is disconnected and stuff, you can definitely tell it's very floaty, but the stiffness that I thought was going to come from the HRV springs on all four corners is not an issue at all. I think a combination of the disconnected sway bar and the bushings at the top of the struts help to cancel that out a lot, so it's still quite comfortable. After having driven for a while, that top spacer mount has slowly compressed and kind of settled in and filled in the gaps on the top more. I did end up popping these panels out just to check the tightness of those top nuts, and they did both need to get turned around an eighth or maybe a sixth of a turn more to snug them back down. So do check that after a little bit if you're installing spacers like this. So with that tightened back down and our top spacers compressed to what I think is probably pretty close to their true ride height, we ended at a total of 29 3/8 inches, so including the HRV springs and the spacers, that's given us around a 2 3/4 inch lift over the stock suspension. The spacers are advertised as 30 millimeter or, about 1.2 inches. But given that they're on the front where most of the vehicle weight is, I'm not surprised that they compress down and are actually giving less than that as a lift overall. Even with the size of this lift, we're not out of the woods yet as far as rubbing goes, so I'll probably end up just having to trim some of this fender liner plastic out. But I am still happy with the increased ride height for the price. And speaking of that, let's talk about the overall price for the entire four-wheel setup. So to lift this Honda Fit 3 inches on all four corners, give or take, what did it cost? The front HRV struts I got from a local junkyard for $60 a piece. The rear springs were $35 a piece from the same junkyard, and the spacer kit was almost $140 on eBay. Now, would I use the same spacer kit again or recommend it? Probably not. As I noted throughout the video, there are a few flaws that I think some other kits might do better. That said, there are spacer kits on eBay that are cheaper. There are some that are more expensive. And I also purchased the 30 millimeter tall version, and there's some places that sell a 20 millimeter tall version. So that is going to be up to sort of personal preference and how you feel the hardware and everything is going to work for your build. All told, that comes out to about $330 that I spent on all the parts and everything. If you're able to get just the HRV springs on the front instead of the entire strut assembly from a local junkyard, you can probably find them cheaper. But overall, I'm going to call it around a $300 build. Okay, so now we've got our suspension set up with the HRV springs plus those strut spacers on the very top. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about my end game for this vehicle and some stuff that's not going to get covered in this video. First off, I wanted to do sort of an ultimate maximum height suspension upgrade, even past the HRV stuff. I picked up these springs from a 2011 Honda CR-V, which I think will work with the HRV top mounts. And I was going to use those along with these struts, which are actually from a 2004 Hyundai Santa Fe. These were the closest ones I could find after searching through a whole catalog that matched the threading and everything at the top that the Fit top nut uses. The same style of bottom mount. The only issue with this is the holes are too small, but if you widen those out, I think this would actually fit the Fit knuckle perfectly. And the spring seat right here is a little higher on the shock, so it'd give you just that little bit more clearance, and the shock itself has a longer travel length. So my plan was to try and combine those with a few extra parts into some sort of ultimate lift, but I don't think I'm going to do that for a couple reasons. The first is that I think it would just be way too stiff. With the HRV suspension being for a heavier vehicle, that already has stiffened it quite a lot, and I think this would just make the vehicle almost unusable for any sort of daily use or even off-roading. It'd just be too uncomfortable and too immaneuverable. And the other reason is I didn't want to lift the car too far, because then we have to start thinking about other parts of the suspension geometry. I have yet to go get an alignment. We'll see how far off it is now with just the HRV stuff. But lifting it even farther, I think we'd run into issues with the control arms and especially the CV axles for steering. If we get too steep of an angle on those, or we lift it too far and there's too much distance, I think we'd run into issues with those potentially binding up or just having a shorter lifespan and getting destroyed. Now, I spent several hours researching other factory axles that I could use in this instance that would plug into the fit transmission, and the fit knuckle have the right splines and everything, but they would just be longer. And unfortunately, after searching through quite a few vehicles, the 2009 Civic, Insights, other generations of fit, the HRV, CRZ, all that stuff, I've discovered that the fit axles, the second gen ones, are actually the longest out of all of those. So if you're lifting one of those older vehicles quite a lot and you need longer CV axles, then grab some fit ones, because that'll be great. But there's no longer OEM axles I can use to extend that functional CV distance. So what I'm going to do for now is keep the HRV suspension as it is. And my plan for the third video in the future is to do a complete HRV conversion using the HRV struts, which are a little bit taller, have some more travel, and the HRV knuckles bolted into them, which will give us a 5-lug conversion. But then we can use the OEM HRV front axles, and those actually will work perfectly with the fit transmission and intermediate shaft, but they're about an inch longer on each side. The only reason I can't use them with the fit is they have different numbers of splines on the outside connection. So if I do a full HRV conversion, we'll use those longer axles, and I'll probably also use some Insight control arms on the bottom to extend those out a little bit. But for now, we're going to leave the suspension with just the springs and spacers. So the last thing to do for this video is to drive it around a little bit, see how it feels, and actually go take it for an alignment now and see how far off of stock we are and if we can get it back into an acceptable range. I took my car down to my local tire and alignment place, and that's something you should always do after you modify or replace any of the suspension components, just in the interest of tire wear and getting the best possible traction on the road. And overall, the numbers looked pretty good. The rear, obviously, on the GE8 is not adjustable at all for camber or tow, so that they left as is, and thankfully it was still pretty much in factory spec. The fronts, the camber was actually okay. It was basically straight up and down, which is awesome. The only thing that they had to adjust was the toe, or how pointed inward and outward the wheels are when you're driving straight. That was out of spec by about 1.5 degrees, but they got that adjusted and everything else looks great. Overall, I'm super happy with how this project turned out. I know this was a really long video for what is a reasonably simple modification to do, but I had a lot of info I wanted to share, make sure everybody that wants to follow along can do so. I think with some strategic rounding, we can definitely call this a $300 lift kit, depending on your parts sources and what you actually end up doing. If you have a lifted fit of any generation or even another Honda vehicle that's not lifted often, I'd love to see it and hear about what parts you used for your build and how much it total cost you. But at the end of the day, that's all I have for this video and this project for now on this fit. So stay tuned for the next one. And as always, thank you so much for watching.